everyone. I'm here to give a short overview of Darwin's most dangerous idea, the idea of evolution by natural selection, or as he called it, descent with modification. Darwin was the first person to come up with a theory that claims that all biodiversity descends from a single common ancestor and then changed over time. And the theory also proposes a mechanism, a testable mechanism, for how that change happens. He called that mechanism natural selection, and it's one of the ways that populations can change over time, and the only way that populations can change in an adaptive fashion to match their environments. And finally, the most dangerous part of this idea that Darwin had probably is that this theory implies that humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in the same way as other life forms, and that got him into some trouble. It's important to remember, like if you're a historian of science, that Darwin's was not the first or the only theory of evolution or change over time, but it was the first to propose this testable mechanism, descent with modification. So what causes populations or allele frequencies to change in a population over time? There are actually 4 different mechanisms of evolution. Mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow are mechanisms that we'll talk about later, but this afternoon we're going to focus on natural selection. So what has to be true for natural selection to occur, for evolution by natural selection to occur? Natural selection has to happen if individual phenotypes vary within species, variations are passed on to the offspring of the parents, if there are more offspring produced than can survive to reproduce, and finally, if the survival and reproduction of those offspring are not random, that is, individuals that have very favorable variations survive to reproduce, or survive to reproduce more, or survive to reproduce more effectively. If those 4 things are true, then evolution by natural selection must happen. So these are very important criteria for evolution by natural selection, and we actually call these postulates, actually, because if they are true, then evolution by natural selection happens. Going through the postulates a little bit more, I wanted to start with postulates 1 and 2. First, phenotypic variation exists, or individuals vary in their phenotypes. How do we know this? Well, Darwin knew it actually because he was a great hobbyist. He loved pigeons, he loved orchids, he loved barnacles of all things, and he studied variation in all of its many forms. He knew that as soon as you start looking at a population, you see variations in all different kinds of traits: size, color, feather shape, patterns, behavior, all sorts of different phenotypes vary. And you know it too if you've ever looked at sort of anything where there's more than 3 or 4 individuals of a species, you see variation. We know that variations are often heritable, but Darwin actually didn't have genetics. So how did he know that some variations are passed on to their offspring? Well, he worked with pigeon breeders and with cattle breeders as well when he lived in England developing his theory of evolution by natural selection. And so even though he didn't know how genetics and heredity worked, he knew that it did work. So he noticed that offspring often resemble their parents in a variety of different characteristics, and he was interested in that fact, and he sort of incorporated that into his theory. These days, we can measure heritability, or the extent to which traits are inherited from parent to offspring, by actually comparing a population. We can look at a population of parents and then compare the average of a parent's trait, for example, height, to their offspring height. So this study is a famous study that was done in 1995 on vet students. And what we have is vet students on the y-axis, their height in centimeters, and then we have the height of their parents averaged on the x-axis. And you can see that there is a positive relationship between offspring and parents that indicates that this trait is heritable. Okay, moving on to postulate number 3, more offspring are produced than can survive. The way I like to think about this is that there is a struggle for existence in this world of ours, which has limited resources. So there's not enough resources in the world for every organism that is born or that is produced to survive to its longest possible lifetime and reproduce to its highest possible extent. That sounds obvious, but it actually has some important implications. So that means there's a struggle for existence because all populations have the potential to reproduce exponentially. We know this by just looking at math, and we'll talk about this a lot later in the class. But here's another observation. Natural populations tend to remain roughly the same size, even though they have the potential to expand exponentially. These two observations lead to a struggle for existence. I'm going to make Rosie struggle for existence in a minute. She's barking. So how did Darwin know this? Well, he actually read this important article by Thomas Malthus, was an economist, and Malthus talked about exponential growth of human populations. Darwin translated this to talking about elephants, and just as one example, he calculated that if you took a single pair of breeding elephants and allowed them to live their fullest lifetime and reproduce as fast as they possibly could, and then let all of their descendants live and reproduce as fast as they possibly could, from that single breeding pair of elephants, you would have 19 million descendants in just 750 years. And he actually talked about that in his large book, The Origin of the Species. And then other scientists have done this kind of calculations with other species, and we're going to talk about this later too. This is obvious that it's not happening, right? We're not up to our armpits in elephants or bacteria or starfish, so something is causing them to struggle for existence, and only a few are making it to reproduction. So what are the factors that actually contribute to this struggle for existence? The best way I can tell you to think about this kind of thing is to think about your favorite plant or animal or microorganism. So think about it in your mind, and then think about what might impede its ability to reproduce to its highest potential. These factors that contribute to what I call the struggle for limited resources, some of these factors are biotic and some of them are abiotic. So biotic factors include predators and disease and competitors and food availability. So those, if you're an animal. So biotic factors include a struggle against other living things. Abiotic factors cause a different kind of struggle. Here we're talking about things that are not biological, but that still involve the environment. So pH and water availability and temperature and day length and sunlight availability and all sorts of other factors like that. And so combinations of factors like this contribute and establish what the struggle is for each individual and for each population. Last but not least, the last postulate is survival and reproduction are not random. In other words, individuals that have favorable variations survive to reproduce, or survive to reproduce more or better. So one example of this is one that we talked about in class, which involves these horned lizards. Horned lizards, if they have long horns, are more likely to survive than the horned lizards that have shorter horns, at least in terms of shrike predation or predation by those small songbird predators. And I wanted to establish here that not all lizards survive with an equal chance. Some with the large horns, the one kind of phenotype, survive at a higher rate than those with smaller horns. So that basically illustrates the fourth postulate, and you can think of other examples here. So this is similar to what we've been talking about called adaptations. All right, finally, if all four of those postulates are satisfied, then evolution by natural selection will happen. So another way of saying that is evolution by natural selection must occur when heritable variation leads to differential reproductive success. What does this look like in the population? Well, what it looks like is that over time, there are more individuals with the favorable phenotypes from the last generation in this new generation. So there's an increase in that number of phenotypes if evolution by natural selection occurs. In terms of alleles, it means there are more alleles in that population that contribute to the expression of the trait that is favorable. So I want to leave you with this quote from Darwin, which he wrote to a friend 15 years before he published his description of this theory of evolution by natural selection. He wrote, "At last, gleams of light have come, and I am almost convinced that species are not immutable." And then in parentheses, he says, "It's like confessing to murder." And this is because he knows that this idea is going to shake up the scientific world, and it did. And we'll talk about that later too. All right, thanks everyone.